Happy Sabbath. This morning we will look at the subject, an incredulous portrait of salvation. An incredulous portrait of salvation. That means we're going to use the book and the experience of the prophet Isaiah, who has recorded the prophecies relating to the coming of the Messiah some 700 years before he actually appeared. Last week we looked at Isaiah and we acknowledged the superlative nature of his penmanship. It is one characterized by the fluency and imbued with a sobering sense of poetic prophecy. It is one of extreme rarity, as he writes. It is of a certain caliber and of a form that is incredulous, because some have not believed it. His world, that's Isaiah, is one deeply imbued in Hebrew orthodoxy that has subsequently taken on sectarian overtones. The prophet is pensive. He's here soliloquizing in a rather pensive way, a kind of kindred word in monologue. Yeshayahu sees that the evidence that he has found evinces the innocence of the accused, in which tears and faith express a joyful lament. What do I mean? We're glad that the Messiah came, but we lament the way that he died. The wounds that our sins have done to him. The prophet's report is inconceivably impeccable. The detail is nuanced. The portrait is compellingly convincing, and the reasoning ably sustained by the evidence and the fulfillment thereof. The portrait itself is characterized by a superb balance between revealed truth and truncated anecdotes. It is nuanced by a sense of anticipation. Isaiah anticipates that when Messiah comes, some will not accept him. Because John 1:11 says, when he came unto his own received him not. Isaiah also knew that he would be crucified. And so we're going to look at the forbidden chapter, that's what they call it, chapter 53. And the reason I say it is forbidden, because if you know those who practice the Ashkenazi religion, they have mostly determined that they will remove the 53rd chapter from the book of Isaiah, from their Bibles. And so they have taken it from their half Torah readings in the synagogue. The half Torah is a selection of readings from the Navim, the prophets. And so when it is a time to read the book of Isaiah, they read to the half of chapter 52, and then next week they will read from chapter 54. They will not read chapter 53 because that is the forbidden chapter in their word. And so this morning we are going to look at the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. It is a remarkable chapter. And as you know, our teachers, former teachers, are largely products of institutional seminaries, many of which are loyal to their denomination's beliefs. The freedom of their scholastic speculation and the boldness in which they have presented their dialectic reasoning altogether presents us, or I should say, prevent us from classifying them as know-it-all. We can't do that. We cannot do that. We must, like the Bereans, read for ourselves. Therefore, we cannot always draw excessive inferences on all the things they have taught us. We ought to examine the word for ourselves. Chapter 53 of the book of Isaiah. And the prophet writes, who have believed our report? Who will believe our reports? Because the prophet here is writing about a subject, a Messiah that was promised in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And now he's writing and he's letting you know this Messiah that is coming is not going to be attractive, that will draw you to him. How can I tell them that this is the Messiah? Who will believe our reports? Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of Yah revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. And when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Isaiah reminding you that he's writing here some 700 years before Messiah is born. As I understand the prophecy in Genesis 3:15. And he's letting you know that Messiah will come sometime down the ages. But when you see him, you will not recognize him because he will not look as your perception leads you to see him. So I want to give you a portrait of what salvation looks like. That's what Isaiah is trying to tell us. Isaiah is saying, I have understood the word. I have had reason to reason with Yah, and I have taken a picture, a portrait of him and what he looks like, and I want to present this. I want to deposit this in the gallery of your mind. But Isaiah knows that people will doubt him, and he wants who will believe our report. How do you tell a people that the King of the universe, the Messiah, when he comes, he will look like a tree out of dry ground, and there will be no comeliness to him? In all his glory, witness him that he's the king. And Isaiah had seen him and knows what he looks like. Isaiah says his train filled the old temple. But Isaiah said, when he comes, he will not look like that. Who then will believe me? He wants to know. When we pass him in the street, how will we know that this is the man? Isaiah goes on. He's despised, and we esteemed him not. We did not give him his due respect. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did not esteem him stricken, smitten of Elohim, and afflicted. But he was wounded for what? For our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we're healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and Yahweh had laid on him the iniquity of us all. This king that is promised in Bereshit, the prophet is quite pedantic with his presentation. He wants not to miss out any points. He doesn't want you to not get this, that he who you see in glory, who is so esteemed and who is so lofty, who knows everything and sees everything and created all things, when he comes in the earth and he takes on human form, he will not be in his glory. He will look like a tender plant in a dry ground, and you won't be drawn to him. As I want you to know that. And he's telling you that in advance. David has the same view. But before we go to David, let's turn our pages back one to chapter 52 of Yeshayahu. Verse 14, join me there. Isaiah again wants you to know, and many were astonished at thee. His visage, his countenance, was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. He was so beaten, so bruised, so battered, Isaiah wants you to know, that he did not look like a human being. That's how they treated the Messiah. You see, we're giving you a portrait of what salvation looks like. We were astonished that his visage was so marred. He was so beaten up by the Roman soldiers. Isaiah wants you to know. So when we sing, just as I am without one plea, you better sing it with some relevance. You better sing it with some meaning. You better come to him who has taken all our transgressions up on himself and died the death that we should have died so that we might live. David has written a companion psalm. Join me in chapter 22 of the book of Psalms. My Yah, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? I'm sure you will identify this because you knew those words, you read those words in the gospel, but David was writing these some 800 years before Yeshua was born. Are you with me? And the interesting thing here is King David, is writing this in the first person as if the Messiah himself was saying it. Maya, Maya, why art thou? These are the words that he spoke on the cross. Why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? How, my Elohim, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and I am not silent. Verse 8, he trusted as Yahweh, on Yahweh, and he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. He trusted in Yahweh. And this is how they were mocking him on the cross. You trust, you save others, save yourself. But David was capturing this 800 years before Messiah came. Verse 14, I am poured out like water, and my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me. Did you hear me? He said, for dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hand and my feet. Did you get that? I don't want you to miss this. Let's read that again for emphasis. Verse 16 of chapter 22 of Psalm. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now, as I indicated, David is writing this some 800 years before the Messiah actually came into being, came on earth. 800 years. And at this time, crucifixion itself was not yet invented. We who have read the scriptures, we know that in Israel, the capital offense, the crime of capital offense, the punishment for it was one of stoning. But David is here letting you know that he will be pierced. He will be crucified before crucifixion was invented. That's the accuracy of the prophecy. The Romans perfected the crucifixion that was invented by the Persians. And so it's 1,000 years before this was invented that we are talking here about what would happen to the Messiah. Not stoning, but crucifixion. It is quite interesting as we read through Isaiah. Isaiah wants you to know that the Messiah will suffer at the hands of the wicked. He will suffer at the hands of the wicked. And therefore, we ought to ensure that we do not fall in the same ditch, intellectual ditch, as those who were astonished at this and mocked him. And mocked him because the word here is clear. Come with me to Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah chapter 14, 2 and 3 and 4. And he said, and it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem burdensome stone for the people. All who would have it away will surely be cut to pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. In that day, saith Yahweh, I will strike every horse with confusion, and its rider with madness. I will open my eyes on the house of Yehudah, and strike every horse of the people with blindness. Every nation on earth today has made Jerusalem a standing agenda item at their business meeting, at their world meeting. Every single nation. Jerusalem does not have any natural resources. It is a kind of land that it doesn't boast the kind of resources that some city have. And the question must be asked, what is it about Jerusalem that Jerusalem has become an agenda? And all the nations of the earth, as they sit down to strategize how they're going to rule, Jerusalem comes up. Zechariah is writing some 500-600 years before Messiah comes, and he says Jerusalem is going to be a burdensome stone at the end of time. The historical nature of these prophecies demand that we take notice. Are you with me? It demands that we take notice because these prophecies are just incredible. So Isaiah draws the veil of silence over the cross, or over the tree, I should say, and none of the lurid details are set forth for the curious mob to gaze and leer upon. It is said of the brutal mob who murdered him that they sat down and watched him. You and I are not permitted to join that crowd. No, we're not. And so we're looking at the portrait that Isaiah presents to us. That's what we come to look at. And some of the critics and the scholars, they would have us believe that there are two Isaiahs. That the first Isaiah wrote the first part of Isaiah, the first 39 chapters, and the second Isaiah, another person that is called Isaiah, wrote the next 27 chapters. That's what they teach in their seminaries, and so they send their ministers out to teach us that. That's if you don't read for yourself. So I'm going to ask you to come with me to the book of John and the chapter 12 and look at, in context, which they call the Deutero Isaiah. Chapter 12, and let's begin reading from verse 38. Let's start from verse 37, because who is here speaking? Messiah is speaking. It says, But though he had done many miracles before them, they had seen the miracles. So he's now in town. He has arrived some 700 years after Isaiah had spoken. But though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not him. What's my subject? Incredulous what? What's my subject? The incredulous portrait of salvation. And so John here is telling you how incredulous this thing is. In spite of the miracles that he had done, in spite of the things that he had said to them, they would not believe him. It's incredulous. Verse 38, that the saying of Isaiah the prophet, are you with me? That the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Yahweh, who had believed our report, and to whom hath the harm of Yahweh been revealed. Now, as you read that, you would say, Helga, that comes straight out of chapter 53. You know that. Let's skip to verse 40. Therefore, they could not believe because, well, let's look 40, verse 40. He hath blinded their eyes and hath what? Hardened their hearts, and they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. Immediately also, you know that comes out of chapter what? 6 of Isaiah, when Isaiah saw him in the temple. So you look at that in the context of what the critics are saying. You read that those two verses, one is from chapter 53 and one is from chapter 6. Let's read verse 39 now. Therefore, they could not believe because that Isaiah said again. Listen to what verse 39 is saying. That Isaiah said again, meaning the same Isaiah who wrote chapter 6 is the same Isaiah who wrote chapter 53, which says the notion of the critics who say we have two Isaiahs is thrown out the window. It is expunged by that very verse. The same Isaiah, that Isaiah writes again, and it's in two different parts. One is in the first part of Isaiah, and the second is in, as you know, the 53rd chapter. So we dismiss the critics and look at what the prophet Isaiah has said. Come with me to chapter 50 and verse 6 and 7. Chapter 50 of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from the shame of spitting, for Yahweh will help me before shall I not be confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I should not be ashamed. Listen to what Isaiah wants you to know, because it's written here in the first person. Yahshua is speaking. I gave my back to the smiter and my cheek to them that plucked off my hair, meaning it plucked out his beard. They robbed him of his beard. Are you with me? They robbed him of his beard. That's how he was mistreated and abused. And so Isaiah wants you to know that all that the Messiah went through was for you and I. And this is why we cannot treat this thing lightly. We cannot treat it lightly. And so it is important now that we look at what was prophesied in Isaiah chapter 53, that one is coming, and we read in John that he did come. And let's go now to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8. And let's look at that aspect of it and see how it relates to our study of the book of Isaiah. Let's go to chapter 8 and verse 26. And the word says, and the angel of Yahweh appeared, spoke unto Philip, saying, arise and go towards the south unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. Then he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopian, who had the charge of the treasure, and had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot reading Isaiah the prophet. The eunuch, the Ethiopian, was reading from Isaiah. What chapter? Chapter 53. He wants to know, who is this that the prophet spoke of? He wants to know, and so the Holy Spirit directed Philip to go and share with him the portrait of salvation. Are you with me? I'm just showing you that we have a stake, we people, we bronze people, we have a stake in this salvation issue. That this man, this Ethiopian, not meaning just Ethiopia that we know today, Ethiopia then including Sudan. The man was reading from the book of Isaiah, and he was reading chapter 53, the forbidden book. What do you learn now? You know that if you're reading from chapter 53, he's not Ashkenazi. Are you with me? And it is interesting that today is an interesting day. Not only is it a Sabbath, but those of us who are from the island, it's a kind of mixed celebration. On the Gregorian sense, we call it the 6th of August. And those of you who are old enough will remember that the 6th of August was the day that Britain supposedly gave independence to Jamaica, and people are celebrating even today. But today is more profound than that, because today is the 9th of Av. And you say, the 9th of what? The 9th of Av, which is the month in the Hebrew calendar that follows what? What does it follow? We don't remember? Tammuz. And we're going into Elul, and then we go into what? What's the 7th month? Tishri. We've got to know these things because they will trip us up. Today they're celebrating, but the 9th of Av is the day in which Nebuchadnezzar came up and destroyed Solomon's temple. It was today in history. It was also the same day, the 9th of Av, when Titus, the Roman general, came and destroyed the second temple. It happened on the 9th of Av. It was also the 9th of Av that Germany declared war on Russia, and the First World War was in progress. It was also the 9th of Av that King Ferdinand in Spain and his wife Isabel drove out the Jews from out of Spain. All the Jews were told to go. But perhaps what you don't know, it was the 9th of Av in 1290 that King Edward I drove out all the Jews out of England. Are you with me? They had been there a long time, even before 1066, even that some of them came in 1066. Some of them are our ancestors. These were not necessarily Ashkenazis. And so the question that we must ask ourselves today that is quite pertinent and germane to our existence in 1290. Remember, the British went there under the Normandy invasion in 1066. 1290, the king decided all Jews must leave England. There weren't many then, there were about 3,000 that left. So if the king drove out all the Jews in 1290, which Jews did they bring to Israel in 1917 under the Balfour Agreement? They know that they drove out not the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic people, who in fact kept the 53rd chapter in their Bible. It was the Ashkenazi who took it out. So when they drove out the Sephardic, they brought in the Ashkenazi into Israel. And so there are people today who are claiming to be Israelite, but Yeshua said they're the synagogue of Satan. And Genesis 9:27 said what? They will dwell, these Gentiles, they're Hebrew-speaking Gentiles, they will dwell in the tent of Shem. And so therefore, I had to give you that so that you can understand that this man, this Ethiopian eunuch, and eunuch doesn't mean somebody who's been necessarily mean somebody who's been castrated. It also means a high office. So let's not go with just the simplistic idea of who eunuch is. So this man came to Jerusalem, according to the book of Acts, to worship. The historians have not provided much for us to understand about him. And so we have to delve into history to ascertain who our brother is, or was. Now, one of the church fathers called Irenaeus, he is a Greek bishop, and this is what he writes. Irenaeus. He says conversion is more difficult with Gentiles than with Jews, indicating that the Ethiopian was a Jew. This is the church father from way back, Irenaeus. And he says, this man, and he names him. He says his name was Simeon Bacchus. That's the name of the Ethiopian man that we see in the book of Acts. Simeon Bacchus, Bachos. This man, Simeon Bacchus, the eunuch, was also sent into the regions of Ethiopia to preach that he had himself believed, and that there was one Elohim preached by the prophet. So Irenaeus, the church father from way back, is saying this Ethiopian was a Jew. And this is why when Philip spoke to him, he didn't flinch. He just said, baptize me. So he's letting you know, Irene, that it would have been more difficult for him to be baptized had he been a Gentile. But because he was a Jew, not only, and he's not just an adopted Jew, but he was more likely a Shemitic Jew, one who was of the house of David. So he came to Jerusalem to worship. And he's reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. But he didn't know who it was that was spoken of. And Philip gave him a Bible study. And soon after, he said, there's water, baptize me. And he was baptized. I really just want you to know, this man went all through Ethiopia, and he was preaching the gospel. That's quite interesting. Very, very interesting, because we have the evidences in Scripture in which we're told that this is our culture. This morning we spoke in Sabbath school about culture. What is culture? This is our culture, where we have all the evidence of our origin, of morality. And what else do we have? We have our destiny. What else? What's missing? Origin, reason. Because every truth must stand up to what? When somebody comes to you and tell you that they have truth, you must put them to the test and say, what is the origin of your truth? What is the morality? What is the reason and the destiny of that which you believe? Bring it to me. Because truth must be logically consistent. It must be verifiable in that it is what? Empirical. And it must be existentially relevant to the times in which you live. It must be. So this Ethiopian man who was reading from the book of Isaiah had come to worship. But I've heard preachers say, oh, he was there. Probably he was just in the Gentile courts. Because he was a eunuch, he couldn't go in. According to Deuteronomy chapter 23. That's what they read. But Deuteronomy chapter 23 had said that until the 10th generation, and David was the 10th from that generation, and David was able to go in. So they're not quoting correctly, and that's why we have to study to show ourselves approved unto Yah. Are you with me? And so the man had come because he understood other things. He understood his own heritage, and he had gone to Jerusalem to worship. And let me contextualize this for you. So I'm going to ask you to join me in 2nd Chronicles. We've been there before, but for emphasis, we need to look at it again. 2nd Chronicles chapter 35. And here we know is good King Josiah in leadership. Good King Josiah. And Josiah in verse 3, and he said unto the Levites, that taught all Israel, which were holy unto Yahweh, put the holy ark in the house, which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, did build. It shall not be a burden unto your shoulders. It shall not be a burden unto your shoulders. Serve now Yahweh your Elohim and his people Israel. Josiah, the good king who took the throne at 8 years old and is a contemporary of Jeremiah, they're about the same age, wants the priest to go and get the ark and put in the temple, because obviously it was not in the temple. And so you reason and ask yourself a question, well, where was the ark? And history tells us that, and as we touched on it last week, the ark was in Elephantine Island in Egypt. And how did it get there? If you remember last week what we studied, we said the Levites had left the north and had come back south because who? Jeroboam had not allowed them to teach. He had chosen his own teachers who were false, and they came back home and stayed in the house. But later on, under the rulership of Ezekiah's son, what's his name? Manasseh, they moved the ark and brought it to Egypt, to Africa. The ark has been in Africa since the time of Josiah. I'm dealing with our culture and our tradition and our issue. The Bible is our tradition. And then it moved from Elephant Island to where? Taniakakis Island. And then from there to Axum in Ethiopia. So understand that we have had long since had, I should say, a portrait of the Messiah. So when Johnny just come Europeans say to you, well, we took the gospel to Africa. All you have to do is to turn the pages to the book of Acts and says, my brethren here had been reading in the first century when he was reading from the book of Isaiah. And if that doesn't convince them, you can go further. You could take them to the First Kings and say, my sister, the Queen of Sheba, she had gone to see Solomon when? Way back then. And so the evidence is overwhelming. It is convincing that we are Yah's dispersed people, and these things were written a long time ago, but the enemy did not want us to know who we are, and so they fudged it, and not only did they fudge it, they redact it and taken some of it out and placed it elsewhere so we wouldn't know our history, and they put it in what they call apocrypha, secret book, and told you not to read it, but we found them, and Yah has made it so that we found the apocryphas, and we read the Maccabees, and we read Yeshayahu, and we read those kind of books, the Jubilee, and we see our history in front of our faces, and so we dismiss the scholastic intent. We dismiss that because the word says, Yah's end is not short. It is not short. Are you with me? And what does it mean when Isaiah writes, Yahweh has anointed me, as in Isaiah chapter 61 that we read earlier? Huh? As you remember, typically it's only kings and priests were anointed. Are you with me? By Yahweh in Israel. There was no king or high priest left remaining in the land when Yeshua came, except John the Baptist, the legal high priest, not Caiaphas or Hannas. And so when Yeshua comes and he went into the temple, according to Luke 4, and he said, Yah has anointed me to preach the good news He was only referencing what Isaiah had wrote in chapter 61. Are you with me? And so this morning, we are pleased to know who we are. And today also we end what we call the Great Straits. That's what today is also. You heard the term, you heard the phrase, I'm in dire straits. But you know where it came from? Even as people celebrate independence today, that term came from the ninth of half. And 3 weeks of it, that starts from the 17th of Tammuz, and it ends today, when the Hebrew people, including our ancestors, found themselves in a dire straits when the temple were destroyed. And they were thrown out of Spain and thrown out of England. They're in dire straits. All of these things come together, culminated on the same day, today. And so today, as we reflect on our history, knowing that even now we're in a dire straits with government. Are you with me? And we are in dire straits with medical inventions. Are you with me? Because you will have understood. And then let's go with me, come with me to not Leviticus, Numbers chapter 21. Numbers chapter 21. Numbers chapter 21. Numbers chapter 21. You remember that while they were in the wilderness, that due to the people's disobedience, Yah had permitted for some serpents to go in and deal with them. Are you with me? So let's look at it. Verse 4. And they journeyed from the mount, or by the way of the sea, to come past the land Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against Yah and against Moses, wherefore have ye brought us out to Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and their soul loatheth dislike bread. They didn't like manna. And I smile because the manna is the word. And today you see people don't like the word. They don't study. You ask them to study for, a couple of chapters or 3 or 4 chapters, and they come on Sabbath and they don't remember a word. They can't even answer, which telling me that people today still don't like the manna. And so when you don't like the manna that Yah gives you, the word that Yah gives you, the truth that Yah gives you, what does verse 6 say? He said, and Yah sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. When you reject the word, you bring calamity upon yourself. Are you with me? You have so much things to do that you're busy doing everything else, but you don't have time to read and to study. And so the serpents of life, are you with me, will sting you. Serpents, they have a sting. like viruses. Are you with me? They have a sting. And some would argue that even in our time, there is a serpent or serpent stinging the people. And perhaps you would ask, what is the sin? But that's not the point I want to make. Verse 7, therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned. What? So when you see things happening to you and you're feeling the sting of viruses, it's because of sin. For we have spoken against Yah and against thee. Pray unto Yah. Moses, we have sinned. Do something about it. Would you say this society has done something, has spoken against Yah? Yes, they have. And Yah said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, will live. Are you with me? Now understand this. Moses made a brazen serpent, and everyone who looks upon it is healed. But notice in the time of Hezekiah, the people began to worship the serpent, and Hezekiah had to tear it down. And so during the time of the Greeks, this is the emergence of Asclepius, the god of healing. And so even today you see this wrapped around a pole. This is what they're mimicking. Asclepius. Are you with me? Because of the serpents that are stinging the people in this society. But what does it mean? You better come with me to John chapter 3. John chapter 3. John chapter 3, because the word here says there was a man who went to see Yeshua. Let's read it. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. The same came to Yeshua by night and said unto him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from Yah. For no man can do these things, these miracles that thou doest, except Yah had sent him. Did you see what I'm saying? He's a leader of the Jews. But he could not convince his other people in the Sanhedrin that this is the Messiah. So he came by night. Yeshua answered and said unto him, verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom. Nicodemus said unto him, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time in his mother's womb? Yeshua said, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a man be born of what? Water. Same as the Ethiopian. And of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Are you with me? In verse 14, I want you to pay attention to. Because Yeshua says, and as Moses lifted up the serpent into the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That which you saw in the wilderness was referring to this. He said, I am going to be lifted up on a tree and be crucified like the serpent. When you look up to me in terms of what I'm about to do to you, then you will yield. There is no explanation in the Old Testament in regards to why a brass serpent, you ask yourself. Why brass? Well, I learned as an apprentice engineer that brass is a conductor of heat. And so when you go through the temple, the first thing you see is what? A brazen altar where the fire is. And it's there to purify. Are you with me? and so this takes us also to Exodus chapter 3. You remember that story with Moshe? And the word said Moshe was attending to his sheep at the back of Oreb. Are you with me? In Midian. And he saw a bush burning. And he was curious enough, so he turned aside to look. It wasn't the fact that the bush was burning that drew his attention, but the fact that the bush was not consumed. Are you following me? And so he went. And when he went there, he got a message to go to Egypt. That bush, you ask, what bush is it? We're told it's acacia wood, bush, the burn. It was burning, but it was not consumed. It was not consumed. And so when you go to Genesis chapter 3, you pick up that bush again. Why? Because Yah says when he cursed the earth, what happens? He says it will bring forth thorns and thistle, thorn, bush. The only use you have for them is to light fire with them. And if you have time, you go to Genesis chapter 22, and you see Abraham was called to sacrifice his son Isaac. And while he was planning to do that, he turned around, and what did he see? He saw a sight. And the ram was caught in a thicket, in some bush. And later on, you saw that Yeshua, when he was crucified, they used the same thicket, the same thorn, the same acacia bush, and they made a crown and put it on his head. Are you with me? That which you saw in Exodus chapter 3, that bush, inference is drawn from that because it's prophetic to link it to Messiah, that he will be sin for you, because remember we talked about judgment and we talked about sin. Fire is judgment, and fire comes to cleanse sin. That's why the earth is going to be cleansed with fire. So when you read Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21, we're told that Yeshua was made sin for us. All our sins were put on him. And therefore he would be the one who goes through the fire, but the fire would not consume him. That's the trials. And so now you must understand what I'm talking about in the book of Daniel, because the three Hebrew boys, they went into the fire, did they not? But when the king looks and he looked into the furnace, he said, did I not see 4 people, even though I put 3 in the fire? They said, yeah. Then he declared, then the 4th one looks like the Son of Man. Wow. It's saying, Moses, the bush that you saw, the bramble, represents sin. And I'm here with fire to cleanse the sin. But the bush is representative of Yeshua because he is like a what? A tree out of dry ground, bramble. But the fire that I will put on him will not consume him. That's what Moses saw. So when you bring all these things together collectively, you have a portrait of what salvation looks like. And so how dare you reject so great a salvation? So even today, the whole thing is incredulous. And Isaiah is saying, I'm telling you the story, but who will believe all that I have said? We've spoken about Messiah. We've spoken about the connection with the Ethiopian eunuch. We've spoken about these things. We've spoken about the need to keep the feast day. We've spoken about, oh, the Sabbath is important. But who will believe our report? Who? In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.